Okay. And here we go. Great. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're here with another of our virtual events. And it's always a treat to have Archer Mayer back with us. He's going to be discussing his brand new book, Fall Guy. Not the Fall Guy, as I accidentally listed it a couple times, but I fixed it. And Archer has been kind enough to sign a batch of books for us. And so I'll put a link in the comments field should you wish to purchase one. And also if you have questions for Archer, go ahead and put those in as well. And I'll come back on screen in another 40 minutes or so and would be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Patrick. What a real pleasure it is to see you, Archer. It's my annual fall treat. We've been doing this together for, good Lord, what, 25 years or maybe even 30?
Yeah, long time. I've lost track. So,
well, let's see. The bookstore is going to be 33 on October 3rd. And I'm guessing that it's probably been 30 years because you were writing this series before I opened the Poison Pen in 1989.
That's number 33. So yeah, it stands to reason.
There we are. Archer is actually an author that I collect. I'm in my own library at the moment. And if I looked over here, if I tilted the screen, you would see the entire array of Archer Mayer books. So I'm really, I love them. And, you know, one of the sad things, Archer, about the rate of business is that I don't have time to go back and reread books that I love. I keep thinking, you know, that one day I will read my way through the entire Joe Gunther, but it's not looking good.
No, not for me either. I like you. My library has thousands and thousands of books. Anytime I want to read a book, I just cross the room. And on top of that, I've got all these books that I read many, decades ago and whatnot. And I keep them because I know I'll go back because, hey, you shouldn't read The Great Gatsby just once. But it turns out you do.
You do. And, you know, there's been a lot of discussions over the years about people who find new things. You know, they reread books at different stages in their lives and the books speak to them differently in the whole bit. But I will say this, that my experience, of course, you know, I have an eidetic memory, so I don't actually forget very much. But my experience is that it's never really as impactful for me to go back. Rather than learning more stuff, I sort of wonder, why did I love it so much? So I'm not sure that I really want to do it. You know, I think, but if you're a real book person, it's almost impossible to let go of books you love.
A friend of mine, a fellow author, living in the same village I live in Vermont, he rereads stuff all the time and totally loves it or doesn't, to your point. You know, he sort of scratches his head, but he's one of these old school guys who, once you start a book, you'll finish a book. I'm not that forgiving. If you haven't grabbed my attention or honored my intellect, I'll toss you across the room. But he, by God, he's a devotee. And it's funny I have lunch or tea actually with him on a regular basis, and we talk books. And he'll give me exactly the insight you're going to, which is, God, you know, I liked it so much better when I was younger.
What can I say? So I have a little glass of, I like BYOB for our event. So I wanted to drink a toast to Archer and our many, many years together. And I'm happy to say that once I was able to visit Archer at home in Vermont, which was really a wonderful experience. And I think you have to see Brattleboro, where in the end, many of the Joe Gunthers, you know, come back to Brattleboro, even when he got his whole all-state remit. And, you know, has been able, and on occasion, as in this book, New Hampshire comes into play or Canada come in. I mean, he's been to New York. He's been, where'd he go? Texas or Chicago?
He's been to Chicago. He's been to Boston. He's been quite far afield. Montreal, yeah.
Right. Well, of
Yeah.
course, Vermont's a border state, I mean, it's, we here in Arizona, we're all focused on the southern border.
Yes.
But when I talk to authors, in Maine, you in Vermont, authors in Minnesota, Montana, we have a whole northern border that I think,
Yep.
because our relationship with Canada is quite different than our relationship with Mexico, we tend to kind of ignore it. But if you wanted to really go back in time, I can't remember if you wrote somebody, maybe it was Paul Doiron in Maine, wrote a really interesting book about during the Revolutionary War, how, we marched up to Canada because we were going to recruit the Canadians to come and
Yeah.
sign with us. Yeah, I mean, to fight with
Yeah.
us.
Yeah. At one point, we were going to own Canada. So
Yeah.
there,
Yep.
but never
So,
got around to that. Probably lucky for them.
well, maybe so. But that the border there has been peaceful for such a long time that I think
yeah.
that's why the attention tends to go south. But in fact, the northern border, it's actually, I'm sure it's bigger, just in the length of it.
I believe it. Oh, yes. No, I don't think there's any doubt about that. It literally goes from ocean to ocean.
Right. And so, Joe, with Vermont, I know one of your books, I'm going to forget all the titles, but I remember one of them, had to do with drug trafficking back and forth from
Yes.
Canada.
Yes.
And,
Oh,
there
yeah.
have been various
illegal aliens as well, which people pay no attention to whatsoever. They crossed the Canadian border, especially in the old days, because it was so simple.
Yeah.
And in fact, there's a wonderful, if I may digress just for a tiny, tiny war story. When I was doing research for one of these books, I think it was called The Dark Route. My God, I can't believe I remembered that. So in The Dark Route, there's a huge involvement across Canadian border involvement in the plot. And a good part of that is the importation of illegal Asians from Canada. And of course, Hong Kong was transitioning over to outright Chinese ownership. And so a lot of the money was leaving Hong Kong and going to Canada. And then from Canada, they were going down to the United States, legally and otherwise. And but there were Pakistanis. There have been all sorts of quite exotic flavors of immigration coming illegally. And so a friend of mine who was on a border patrol couldn't resist showing me some footage, which was taken from the top of a surveillance tower with night vision camera work and whatnot. And they were sort of playing around with this new border patrol officer. So you see him driving around and they said, well, there's some activity at the border. You might want to check it out. And so you see him leave his truck and he goes across the field. And now, of course, he's right at the border and it's dark. And there he is all by himself with his flashlight. And he said, where are they? And his radio says, well, they're all around you. And he went, sounds like this creepy moment of, what do you mean they're all around me? So more power to him. He says, you're all under arrest, U.S. Border Patrol. And about 20 people rose all around him out of the meadow of overgrown grass. They were hiding, literally, somehow or another. He had walked into their midst without discovering them, and they all just gave up.
That's an amazing story, because it sounds like it was really a snipe hunt, but then it turned into a real thing. So,
I imagine he was quite scared until he realized that they just wanted a home. I mean, that's the sad part of so much of this is that, they're not violently inclined in the least. They're just looking for harbor.
Very true. I just looked up and, that was your 6th book. So that was a long time ago. It was back in the 90s. I can date them, but if you look, this is, the page, and pretty soon it's going to be double columns and all of Archer's amazing work. And just before we talk about this book, for a while, and I think it's still going, you decided to keep your earlier books in print yourself.
I did, yes. About 18 titles I own outright.
Right.
And the reason being, of course, that from the get-go, having experience in the business before I began writing, because I was in the publishing game, albeit as a scholarly editor for a scholarly publishing house in Texas, but nevertheless, it's somewhat the same operation. So I had a working knowledge of what goes on that side of the tennis court. And so when I began to write these books, I did so with a business eye. And one of these things was that sooner or later, I knew they would put me out of print because I was writing too many bloody books. And so as they began to go out of print, which they did tumultuously, they kept me alive and they kept me alive and they kept me alive. And then all of a sudden they said, oh, okay, well, we've taken a look at your backlist and we're just going to get rid of the backlist. And I went, hang on, because I had been reading the trades and I actually knew what the business was doing. And I was very aware of virtual books, ebooks, that kind of stuff that was just coming in. The publishers initially were paranoid. They just saw this as the enemy, that maybe they just subsume them, that ebooks was a terrible idea and wasn't going to go anywhere. Well, I, of course, went, this is the future, at least a future. And so I said to them, well, of course, you're perfectly right. You should remainder all these terrible books, lousy things. You don't want them. Tell you what, just give them all to me for free. And I'll take on the onerous burden of publishing them so that all the boats will rise on the incoming tide and other cliches of that nature. Well, I was stunned because they bit. They went, oh, sure, what a great idea. And I went, oh my God, you idiots. So they gave me all the rights free for, at that point, 15 or so books, onto which I would manage to tack on 3 more before they woke up to their folly. And that's been keeping me alive ever since. All this backlist, because I went to audiobooks, I went to ebooks, I went to paperbacks. So it's been actually quite pleasant.
Well, it is, but it's wonderful for readers because, not everyone is, been with you all the years that I have. And so when they read one of your new books and they want to go back, because there's a huge history involved with Joe and, and Sammy and all the people in Joe's world. And, you want to go all the way back to open season and work your way forward. This is his 3rd or 4th romance, I think.
Who's counting?
but I mean, one of the reasons that the series is so powerful, Archer, is that everybody keeps evolving. All of your characters. It's not like they're not Teflon. They go through some experience and then bang, they're back and nothing has ever changed. So Joe is aging slowly, thank God, more slowly than we are. But his personal life has gone through some big upheavals. Remember when you took a big chance on his lover for a long time and she was raped and you wrote a really powerful book about, how that was. And then she got into politics and, they never really recovered from what happened to her. And then he had another romance and that was pretty tragic. And and now the woman who's been there circling around through the entire thing, the medical examiner, whom I've always really liked, Beverly Hillstrom. Now she and Joe are together, and as you point out, the lives of cops are not great material for marriage because they work terrible hours and they can be in danger. They are obsessed with their cases and all. So Beverly really is the ideal person for him because, she understands his life and he understands her life, and they give each other space in a way that is unusual, I think, in a relationship.
The cliche in the real world is cops and nurses.
Oh, doctors and nurses.
Well, yes, but then we're off the topic of cops.
True.
But a lot of my police buddies married nurses, and a lot of it is because of the nature of the work and the hours of the work.
Right.
And there's this inordinate compatibility. And as you know, I used to be a cop for several years, and I am still a death investigator for the state, where I do those kind of that kind of detective work, and I've been doing that for well over 20 years. And all of that calls you out on a irregular basis. 3 o'clock in the morning, you leap out of bed and off you go for hours at a stretch. And it does stir up a private life, but it also, of course, stirs up my creative juices in order to talk about and write about these people in a realistic mean.
Well, you're not just, have copy experience. You've been an EMT, you're in the volunteer fire department, you're a death investigator and all. And of course, that's one reason there's so much authenticity to your books. Now, I really love this conversation I've had with some other authors recently about the structure of stories. And I love the fact that police investigations generally proceed forward, in a kind of orderly manner. I mean, there's the instigating incident, there's frequently a background, it can be a cold case or something, but the general trajectory of the story is forward. And my mind works that way, I'm trained in the law and so forth. And I like the way that police investigations, progress and things are revealed. And eventually you get to what generally, not always, but generally is a satisfying conclusion where justice is really done and so forth. So it's one of my favorite forms. Crime fiction is an enormously diverse
yes, certainly
literature is a very broad umbrella and getting broader all the time, because now we're getting time travel and fantastical elements and Gothic elements, which is an older genre that's making a huge comeback, etc. But there's something about me that relates really well to police investigations and or even private eye, because they're in many ways very similar. It's just that the private eye doesn't have powers of arrest and doesn't have to follow the rules. Although I don't know that we could say that Joe and his team are necessarily always following the rules, which is part of what's fun.
It's a little squeechy sometimes. Yes.
Well, some of them are, less rule following than others. Yes. But, but along with that, you really, as I said, have developed Joe's team to a remarkable degree, and his progression from local cop in Brattlesboro up to the head of the Vermont Bureau of Investigation, so he can go all over the state, has been a really fascinating one to watch. But in this book, as in some others, there end up being jurisdictional disputes or jurisdictional issues, because some of the crimes are not in Vermont. So in this case, we're talking New Hampshire. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about how this book progresses? Because usually there's oftentimes a kind of a small thing that will kick off one of these cases, or occasionally it's a big crime.
Yeah. Well, in this case, reflecting my own reality that we've already touched on, which is I get called out for casework all the time. And, you enter a door and you meet the first person who briefs you, and then it goes from there. Detectives are always called in after the uniformed guys. So in Fall Guy, similarly, Joe arrives, the lights are already lit up, and the scene is already being cordoned off. And what is the scene? Well, it's a car in a ditch. And as the light begins to fade on this crisp, wintry day, Joe gets appraised by those who came before to tell him that, yes, it's a car in a ditch. Yes, it was a stolen car. Yes, the car is filled with purloined stuff, cell phones, jewelry, precious items, laptops, you name it. And of course, irresistibly, yes, in the trunk, there's a dead guy.
What a surprise, right?
Yeah. And of course, there are immediately, and in the dialogue of that very first chapter, there are immediately a couple of sort of reflections of how these things really work. So you have someone sort of say, "Oh, well, there's a dead guy in the trunk. I wonder what that's all about," and blah blah blah. And so Joe very quietly says, "Where's the other guy?" And they sort of look at him like, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, do you think he killed himself and put himself in the trunk all by himself?" No, there's somebody else was involved, and somebody therefore got transport from that scene away. So there was another car involved also. Did you look for tire tracks? And this crosstalk begins to blossom into a case. And immediately what they discover is that the car comes from New Hampshire. Well, and New Hampshire in the context of this book is literally less than 10 miles away, heading east on the other side of the Connecticut River. Well, as a result of this proximity, law enforcement in both states communicate and cooperate on a regular basis. So it's just a matter of setting up that mechanism to create a two-state task force. And we see Joe do this. And just as so many people in law enforcement know me personally because of my background, so they all know Joe, regardless of whether it's in New Hampshire or not. So I like to introduce the small town, rural, problem-solving, pragmatic approach, which you don't see visited in things like the Harry Bosch books, where the politics are so huge and the population's so densely, packed that politics, in a funny way, become miniaturized and incredibly angry. In my world, there are only a few players. And so, yes, there may be sort of turf and there may be a little bit of jealousy and a little bit of this, but there's problem solving holds sway over all of it. And so I wanted to touch a little bit on that. So we have Joe set up the structure and then pursue on the lines of this structure the cases that are born from this cornucopia of clues in the car. Because not only do you have a dead body, but you have the car and you have all the contents that I alluded to earlier. With each one of those cell phones, each one of those pieces of jewelry, each one of those computers belong to somebody. So is the smoking gun as to who killed this guy belong to one of those clues? Well, you got to chase it all down and do it in a highly organized way. And sure enough, we not only discover toward the end of the book who done the bad deed, but we additionally find out several other things that are completely unrelated, but which belong to each one of the pieces of evidence that were picked up. Because this guy's a thief, so he's stealing stuff from a lot of people. And we are not all innocent. In fact, few of us are entirely innocent. And so there's some bad stuff that's going on, and it's amusing in the context of the book for them to go, well, did you look at this cell phone? They went, oh yeah, some guy who's got the hots for his secretary. We're not interested in that, and they go to something else. So little by little, you get this idea that this one car is carrying the biographies of a dozen people. Now that for me was fun.
Yep. And the amazing thing is, and I'm, maybe true for you, is certainly true for me, that increasingly our entire lives are in this phone.
Yes.
I remember John Sanford, who's a writer I'm sure you admire and whom I absolutely adore. And he said to me not long ago, he said, if I lose my phone, I'm just going to kill myself. He said, because my whole life, is in this phone. And I had an awful moment when, one of the unfortunate artifacts of getting older is that your short-term memory sometimes, is not all it could be. I couldn't find my phone, and I had one of those, heart-stopping moments about what am I going to do? Because You could see it in the CJ Box has got the Joe Pickett's have had their first season on television. And there's a crucial moment when his little daughter, older daughter, is being pursued to her death, probably by the bad guy.
Yeah.
And she picks up the phone, but she has no idea what her mother's phone number is because we're all so used now,
Yes.
I used to be able to, used to have all those numbers. We're old enough to remember that, of the people important to us. We knew what their phone numbers were now, but we don't know that anymore.
Right.
And so, we're increasingly dependent upon, these devices, and they are revelatory of details of our personal life, as you say. So if the cache of cell phones is found in this murdered petty thief in the car, everyone who's phone there is, no matter what your security is, law enforcement, I think, can at least retrieve at least your phone messages, right?
Oh, good Lord. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, that's the magic of my associations and my research and whatnot, is I'm actually intimately familiar with what you can get out of a cell phone. And trust me, there's not much left behind. These guys are good at draining those things, not only of everything that is on it, but everything you think you deleted, which you did not, and on and on and on. It's precisely why, to your point, if you wanted to steal or deep six one of my cell phones, I wouldn't miss it for a moment because I have nothing on a phone.
Well, clever you. Look at the January 6th people, or look at all the people around Trump, whose phones are being subpoenaed, and, the really ridiculous civil service and whatever it is people are saying, oh no, the messages were deleted. Guess what? They're never actually deleted.
Right.
And, they can be found again. And I've avoided, I can't avoid a cell phone and other things. Your car is now a computer. Somebody can hack your car and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. And there's really not much you can do to prevent that unless you buy an old junker. But I don't want, for example, like a smart security system that unlocks my front door or whatever it is, because if you have one, somebody can hack it, an old-fashioned key.
Absolutely. And in fact, in this book, Fall Guy, I utilize that because this abandoned car in the ditch is high-end and recently built. Right. And the guys get into the car computer and they find out lots of stuff about where that car's been.
Exactly. The car GPS, can reveal that to you. If you read British police procedurals, there's hardly like 12 feet of the UK that isn't under some sort of surveillance camera. There's no way. But, in rural Vermont, this is not going to be true. There are not cameras hanging off trees everywhere you look. So, in fact, the car GPS really sort of fulfills the function of CCTV, which I thought you used extremely well in this story. And, that's one of the things I've always loved about your books is you start out, I'm trying to remember which book is it where we start out with a crime in the rail yard or by the rail tracks. It isn't that long ago.
Oh, Lord, I'm not sure I can remember the title of that one, but I know exactly what you're referring to. I wish I could remember the title.
It's just an astounding case, and it goes off in directions that, seem obvious and then find out they're really not. That was, I thought, one of your very best plots. I'll have to let me look at the table of contents, or which I could remember which one it is, but it was extraordinary. Three can keep a secret? Proof positive? Presumption of guilt? No.
Yeah, I don't know. No, I shake my head in wonder, not in a negative way.
But it was just brilliant that, starting on the basis of this body in the railroad yard, you wound up in places that are so unexpected. There's all this thing about domestic suspense and the terrific twists, and you can't ever see what is coming. But in fact, Archer is a master of doing this in the context of a police procedural where you absolutely cannot imagine where the case is going to end up. You just can't.
I used to tell people that I was like an air traffic controller with no windows and no radar. It's just I have that kind of brain that that keeps airplanes in flight. I actually don't write an outline. I don't keep notes. I do the research. Then my brain is filled with more than I need to do one of these books, and then I just write.
Indeed, you do. Patrick thinks that book might have been called Trace. Does that seem right to you?
It could well be. You're asking the wrong guy.
Me too, unfortunately. There we go.
I wish I could be, I wish I could obviously be more self-serving and rattle these titles off, but he may be be right. I just don't know.
Wait, Willie Kunkel's case starts with a child's discovery of that's it. 3 teeth on a railroad track. Very nice, Patrick. That is exactly the book.
That is Trace.
It's not the body, it's the teeth. That's right.
The teeth. Yes. That I would have remembered because Trace has 3 separate investigations in its context. And the reason I did that was because as a working cop, when I wrote that book, it occurred to me that, of course, we turn on the TV or we watch movies or we read these books, and it's always the squad pursues a case. And I'm guilty of that. But no cop in his right mind did that. I mean, when my specialty was sex crimes against children, and I did that for several years. And I had 20, 25 cases going simultaneously all the time. A good day would be when they dropped down to 12 open cases or some such. So it occurred to me, now, how can I write a book in which I at least allude to the multiplicity of jobs without completely baffling my readers? Because obviously I can't put 12 cases in a single book. So I did these 3 cases, and people were saying, oh, that's a great idea. I can't wait until you wrap them all together at the end. And I went, no, you missed the point. Yeah. They're separate cases. They are not going to be wrapped up. They're just done by the same people. And it was cool. I enjoyed myself thoroughly doing that one.
Yeah, no, but I mean, that is so realistic. I mean, if you go back and look at Ed McBain, the 87th precinct, and when wasn't everybody in the precinct house wasn't focused upon one case, or if you go all the way back to Del Shannon, who's police procedurals with Lieutenant Luis Mendoza of the LAPD, I absolutely loved. There were always multiple cases that the squad was working on. However, generally for a storytelling purpose, Archer, there was like one through line case. You know, there was like a main case that would pull you all the way through to the end but then, and the other ones, you know, were kind of like branching along the spine of that one story. And that does make sense for a reader to, you know, to be able to follow that. So of the various characters, we know Joe is still Joe, and Beverly Hillstrom, the medical examiner, we pretty much, I mean, she's a terrific and interesting character, and she has a daughter who's a player in the story. She's a reporter, right?
That's correct. Yes, we first meet her in one of the earlier books as a student,
right?
Who has a fairly actually traumatic time in school because her roommate gets murdered, and that involves Joe in the case investigating. But she eventually evolves, graduates, and becomes a reporter at the local paper in Joe's town of Brattleboro.
That's right. So she becomes, from time to time, involved in Joe's investigation. Maybe the most interesting character, the most challenged character, is Willie Kunkel, and his story. I mean, I'm trying to remember, was he there from the very beginning, or? He was.
Yeah, he has the peculiarity of being one of the only cops you'll meet who is actually disabled. He has a lame arm. And the arm became thus in Open Season, the very first book.
Okay.
So he was front row center. It was a somewhat ham-handed, metaphor for his being a fractured man. But it seemed to me that when I constructed the Joe Gunther character, which I was driven to do because I wanted to to build a series around a hard-working, decent guy. No, he didn't have a tragic past history. No, he didn't have 43 prior marriages. No, he wasn't beaten as a child. And no, he wasn't a recovering alcoholic. And all this stuff that so many authors superimpose on their heroes. I wanted to wipe that slate relatively clean, give him a perfectly normal biography. I mean, yes, he's a combat veteran and whatnot, but no big deal. He doesn't wake up screaming in the middle of the night, but he's a good guy. He's honest and decent and avuncular and helpful and a team player and incredibly boring if you really wanted to get down to it. So I surrounded him with these, I thought, fairly interesting group of people. Paramount among them is Willie Kunkel, who is sort of the dark side of Joe's light side. In a funny kind of way, what I was trying to do is to build an entire personality out of two different characters, the yin and yang of us all. We all have our dark times. We all have, I hope, our good times, our generous times. And that's Willie and Joe. And that's why they respect each other, why they work together so well, and why they stick together throughout the entirety of the series.
Yeah, they do. And of course, Joe from time to time has to protect or defend Willie's job.
Yes.
But you've also given Willie a person of his own in Sammy, and eventually a child. And he seemed like the least likely person that would have a successful relationship, let alone become a father. So that's been an interesting thing to evolve across the series. And in this book, what's Willie's role?
Well, Willie is Willie, and thus is always the barely tethered loose cannon. So we can't get him fired, so he can't misbehave too terribly much. So he is roughly under control, and you very accurately put your finger on Joe paying very close attention usually to what Willie's doing, or if it's after the fact, he doesn't ask Willie how he got that information. He just says, I don't want to know, deniable plausibility. And but I have afforded Willie grace notes. I always do, so that he's not just the guy you love to hate, but you hate to love, because he redeems himself on a regular basis. And as a result, for example, I have a scene here where he's just doing his job and he's interviewing a young woman who lives in a trailer, and he goes into the trailer and he has a perfectly normal conversation, getting information from her. And he's sort of Mr. Tough Guy, but she's fine and he's fine. It's all very civilized. And then he says, hang on a sec. Hold that thought. I'll be right back. I'm just going to step outside into my car. And he does. And he calls up his daughter because it's now bedtime for her. And with the dome light on and his cruiser, he pulls over a copy of Goodnight Moon and reads to her. And then he turns off the light, goes back into the trailer, and finishes the interview with his person there. So those kind of gestures on the part, I love that paradox. I don't want to just create a cliche. I want you to be continually surprised and occasionally heart melted by Willie.
Well, and he also serves a useful function because, since he's not a respecter of rules and not, Joe is a pretty much by the book, straight-laced kind of a guy. Yeah, Willie, nope. So, you're right that he's very useful. And Joe's way of dealing with that is generally not to ask what happened, because, sometimes you don't have the leisure to do the by the book kind of thing. But you always have to keep in mind, if you're a cop, you have to keep in mind, if you break the rules, whether you'll ever be able to drag this guy successfully through the courts.
Right.
And, so somebody has to pay attention to the proper procedure, but it's useful to have a guy like Willie who, can find out things maybe without warrants or other stuff. And then Joe can sometimes figure out a plausible way that he got this information.
Sure. Fruits of the poisonous tree, a phrase you know all too well.
I do. Yeah. But, sometimes Willie actually is able to save people, because sometimes the proper procedure is just going to be too damn slow.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
To make things work out. And, and Sammy has her own, Willie's partner and the mother of their child. She has her own stuff that goes on. And so Joe has moved from, a lot of this book is in Brattlesboro, but Joe has formed a team with the BBI in which Willie and Sammy, so forth, can participate. So they do get to move around in a much larger way than they did at the beginning.
I think the advantage that I took that I seized with both hands early on was that I knew from the start, it was a plan from the start, much as I plan anything in my life, which is not, to make this a series.
Yeah.
It was always my intention not to write one book, open season, and then see what else was interesting. This was going to be War and Peace, where each chapter was a book.
Well,
and thus you'd have the same people, you'd have this evolution, you'd have this growth within the series, but I would also honor my writer's paranoia about the publisher always wanting to put you out of print. So each book had to be a freestanding novel, but it was part of an overall body of work where the interrelationships were an important part of the fabric.
So let me bring up my last point before we call Patrick up, which is this is not just a story about Joe Gunther, a series about Joe Gunther and his crew. This is also a series about Vermont, which is the state that Archer clearly loves. And I'm going to quote from a review for this book from Archer has always had amazing reviews. Reviewers love your books. So as always, it says, the author takes an unsparing view of life in northern New England, capturing the region's beauty and economic disparity while spinning a heart-pounding tale in which each character, clue, and subplot comes together with purpose. Even this far into the series, the supporting characters surrounding Gunther continue to grow and surprise. But to my mind, this is as much about Vermont as it is about the plots and the people. And, I have a cousin by marriage who lives there. I have visited Vermont. It's not a state that I know really well, but thanks to your books, I feel almost like a citizen. And you mentioned at one point, there's a beautiful scenic highway in New Hampshire in this book. And I remember driving it in the fall. And it's extraordinarily beautiful.
Yeah.
So I do think sometimes we identify long-running series by the place as much as we do the people.
Oh, sure.
Tony Hillerman, now his daughter Ann, Stephen Havel, New Mexico, the Spencers, Boston, that Paretsky is Chicago. It's almost, the landscape is a character. And I think you worked very hard at making Vermont a character, whether we're in Middlebury or whether we're in Brattlesboro, or if we're over in the Eastern Kingdom, or wherever we are. And I think that's one thing that your readers love. Do you have feedback from Vermonters about
sure.
how happy they are that you're doing this?
Not only that, but suggestions. So yeah, they're sure. They absolutely pick up on exactly what you said, that I have made of Vermont a fundamental character of the series of books. And so they aid and abet, and will reach out to me and say, wow, have I got a place for you? And I will absolutely seize on those opportunities to see what they're talking about. And time again, I go, absolutely. And I put it in a book.
Yeah, I think Bellows Falls is one of your most evocative books about, a part of Vermont that you wouldn't necessarily.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Perfect case in point.
Let's call Patrick up and see what Patrick might have to say from viewers or just from his own. Thank you, Patrick, for looking up Trace.
No problem.
Yes.
I kind of looked at all the covers and I noticed there was a track on the front of, and
Good Lord.
I
The
said,
one time you could tell a book from its
Oh my
cover.
God, a trained sleuth is a bookseller. It's wonderful.
so
And a
anyway,
miracle, because usually the jackets have nothing to do with the contents, but boy, you got it that time.
yeah, yeah. Are there any authors or series that have inspired you along the way? Are you an avid mystery reader yourself, or?
No, I'm not. I used to be, but I no longer am. And the reason for that is part of what we touched on in this entertaining conversation, at least for me. And that is my background has been emergency services for 40 plus years. I literally right now, I can
You're on call.
here, right off my belt is my pager, and I'm on call right now. Obviously, I've got backup arrangements so that someone else can handle if it all of a sudden went off. But if you lead a life like that, it's going to keep you on your toes and keep you perpetually exposed to the world in these books. Therefore, the last thing I want to do in order to escape and relax and put my feet up on the table is to immerse myself in a good murder mystery. That's all I do is death and investigations and horrible things that people do to people. I want to get away from that. So I know one is supposed to show one's own book, but right here is a perfect example of the kind of book I read, which is an entire book on the history of the Middle Ages. So that's how I
read a lot of nonfiction because we've talked about that in the past.
Yeah.
And circling back to Vermont, I lost a thought briefly there, probably because I was drinking wine, which is that for a long time, Archer has traversed Vermont as his book tour. He's gone to one location after another and so forth. And so he's only been to the Poison Pen a couple of times because Vermont is his focus. So a benefit of COVID, at least in Archer's case, is that he is able to appear in a wider range, or at least in Scottsdale anyway, with me, which is fabulous because I look forward to it every year, rather than touring Vermont. And that's obviously the focus of your audience. And I saw, by the way, that Northshire Books has just changed hands, and that must be. And so it's a wonderful bookstore. I've been to it a couple of times, but that has to be a major outlet for you.
I think in a nutshell, it's the best bookstore in Vermont.
Don't they have a branch in Saratoga Springs now, New York?
Yes, they do.
Wonderful.
They do.
I've been to visit it. It was like a pilgrimage, go to Saratoga Springs. And what do? I skip FDR and all of the springs, and I go to see the branch of Northshire Books. But that's what we book people do. It's a wonderful store, beautiful building. And I can see why, it would be so wonderful for you to tour around the state. So have you gone back to that now that COVID is relaxed?
Oh, yes, without a doubt. And even when COVID was up and running, COVID, of course, minimally affected me because being an emergency responder, I had to respond anyhow. So whether I wore a mask or a whole Tyvek outfit or whatnot, I was either writing books at home or responding as I've been responding for decades. Insofar as the bookstores went, you're right that this medium had presented itself as one solution, but there were also, meetings that were somewhat homogenized, if you will, with distance and use of masks and whatnot. So Vermonters are wonderful problem solvers. And so even during COVID, we managed to meet one another. I'm delighted, obviously, that that is mostly behind us at this point, so we don't have to worry about that to the degree that we were. But back in the old days, during a 2.5 month period, I would do 100 appearances.
I know you were.
which means sometimes I guess my record was 4 in one day. And I would literally travel to a motel somewhere, and then I would visit all the bookstores in that, on the periphery of that circle. That was madness, but I was 25 years younger, and I could take that in stride. Now I do a scant, I don't know, 15 or 12 appearances and think I haven't showed up at all. There's no heavy lifting left in it, having started with that egregious an overextension. So now, it's a piece of cake. I just sort of do it to catch up with my pals, if you will, because I'm nowhere without you guys, and beyond you guys, my readers. And it always drives me crazy when authors say, "Oh, books tours, oh, what a bore." And when a bore, those are the people who are keeping you in business, for God's sake. Go out there and honor them, answer their questions and show up and wear a tutu, for God's sake. Do show that you appreciate their time and their money. They're out there for you. So least you can do is once a year come out from under your rock and answer their questions. I like it. I think it's a fun process. And as I touched on, then next thing you know, they buttonholed you and they say, I got a story for you, or I got a place you need to visit, or all that stuff. It's great fun.
It's sort of like going back to the office. There's stuff there that you miss if you don't. I'm sorry, Patrick, what?
I was just going to ask, are there many other mystery or crime fiction authors writing in your area? Or do you have a nice little monopoly on it?
No, not really. I mean, they're good Lord, why am I blanking? I can't think of, well, you touched on Paul, of course, in Maine. That's a little bit of a broader geography than maybe you intended, but Sarah, why am I forgetting Sarah's last name? That's embarrassing. God, she would never make a mistake like that. I will appear with other folks, but I'm lousy with names, obviously, and I'm dropping the ball egregiously here. But there are not many. It's true. So there are a handful compared to the bigger marketplaces, New York and LA and whatnot, for obvious reasons. I mean, good Lord, there are only 500,000 people in Vermont from border to border.
In New Hampshire, I think Brendan Dubois lives in New Hampshire. Jane Clowland, although she lives in New York, has set her antique series in Vermont. There are quite a few authors in Maine, obviously. I mean, from Stephen King and, Paul Doyer and Tess Gerritsen lives there. I'm trying to remember whether Luann Rice actually lives there, but she's a Paul Doyer fan, so we've done events with Paul. I can't recall.
Sarah Stewart Taylor.
Just up
the road from me.
But she's writing about Ireland, not Vermont.
No. But she lives just up the road. Yeah. So no, you're right. People writing about Vermont versus living in Vermont. It's a little confusing.
So there are a couple of questions that have come in here.
Okay.
Mark, some good ones here. Let's see here. Well, first of all, what books did you read when you were growing up? Were there books that were important to you? Yeah.
Well, and a little odd, John Buchan, whom nobody knows. Except some of us. So, and I cut my teeth on. Everyone knows John Buchan because of the 39 Steps, which is legitimate. But he wrote a half dozen or more books, and they're terrific. And at my age, at that time, they were just wonderful books for a young boy, brain starting to come alive with tales of adventure and manly deeds and whatnot. And Buchan gave me a sled ride that for which I've always been grateful. And then, funnily enough, many years later, I introduced him to my daughter, and she couldn't get enough of him. So I was just delighted that Buchan lives on. Even PBS has done some shows based on Buchan's work. So he was quite formative, and relatively few people know about him. Obviously, Sherlock Holmes, then later, of course, Dashiell Hammett and others of that ilk. Another one who relatively not known now is Ross Macdonald. I read tons of Ross Macdonald, and I think if you were to look at my work in comparison to Macdonald's works, you would see an influence. Of which I'm perfectly happy to acknowledge. I thought he was a very good writer. I think he got a little lost in the weeds because he would. It demeans it to say that he wrote the same book again and again and again, but he had certain themes he couldn't let go of. And that was, they say that you should pay attention to your parents for both how not to parent as to how to parent. And I looked to Ross Macdonald as how to not write as well as how to write. So I owe him a double debt of thanks. Although the second half of that is not all that complimentary, but he was formative. So those were the core influences when I was growing up.
It's funny because I run a hard-boiled discussion group here at the bookstore, and periodically, of course, we have to check in with Ross Macdonald, and we've read books from various points of his career. And I think one of the things that we noticed was that the later ones, in the 70s, the last ones that he wrote, they really feel like they're written, they're in the 40s. They don't. Yeah. It seems like Archer is still in that world rather than kind of in the 70s Los Angeles.
Yes.
He's also another one that, that made the place he wrote about so important, Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
The setting was important for him. He never could quite get over the father-son thing. That was his constant theme.
My point exactly. Yeah. Exactly right. Exactly.
That's why there is a similarity, I think, in, a thematic similarity.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, let's see. Another question is about, it seems like your series would lend itself beautifully to, long form TV. And we're really in this renaissance or golden era, really, of cable TV series. And can you see somebody doing a good job, doing a sensitive?
At this point in my career, anybody with a pulse.
You take Lorenzo Lamas, right? You'll take
Pia Zadora, where are you now? I got this character, Joe Gunther. You'd be perfect. It's like, what? Pia who? Right now it is true that there is some interest being shown. We have some folks, that are circling around us and coming up with ideas, and I wish them well. And but this has happened before, and not much has occurred as a result. But hope springs eternal as long as the ball is out in the middle of the playing field and people are taking swats at it. That's all that counts to me. And maybe this will come about and bear fruit. If it does, God knows I have a lot of material to supply them with.
Yeah. Well, that makes you attractive. And I think that long form television storytelling is here to stay. I don't think it's going to fade with the pandemic. So we can hope that anyone that has a successful established series, and particularly one rooted in a particular landscape, because that works so well, whether it's Shetland or, there's Australian, New Zealand. If you look at Broken Wood in New Zealand, it's really all about that. So, let's hope. I would love to see them. I think Willie would be a challenge to cast, but I think the rest of it.
At one point someone said, who would you choose as Joe Gunther? And I said, Peter Dinklage. And there was this dead silence. And then all of a sudden people going, oh,
he's a badass actor.
There.
Yeah. Yeah, call the series just Gunther. That would be kind of cool.
It would.
If you have to decide on a title, it means we're up and running. So I'm with that.
Well, let's hope for the best.
Yep, indeed.
Anything else, Patrick?
let's see here. I think that's just about it. Although there's kind of a fun question. Let's see, I lost it. Debbie, here it is. If you could dine with one other author, who would it be, living or dead?
Good Lord.
Buchan. No.
Yeah, why not? Let's start where I started. Sure, why not? That would be
Shakespeare.
highly entertaining.
What about you, Barbara? It's a fun question to consider.
Who would I, well,
Who would you have
for
dinner
a
with?
sentimental reason, the person I'd really like to spend more time with is Sue Grafton because I miss her every day. But I really
That's a
don't know.
toughie. That's a hard one.
It is
It's a very hard one because as soon as you say something, you go, oh, why didn't I think of so and so?
I've been focused on crime fiction for such a long time, but I'm actually a far more diverse reader. I could go back and
You've met everybody in crime fiction.
well, not everybody. There's some that but many of the people that are important, I have had an opportunity to meet, whether I'm sitting, in the Savoy in the ladies' room with PD James talking about her work or dining with Ruth Rendell or whatever it all is. But I'd probably have to go back. I would probably go back and say not Jane Austen, but Georgette Hare, whose books are still some of they're among the few books that I reread, and I am never disappointed in them. I mean, there's just something about her voice, that time period. I think A Civil Contract and The Unknown Ajax are beyond brilliant. So she was apparently, unfortunately, and this is true, you should be careful about meeting your heroes. Because even though she was a wonderful writer, by many accounts, she was not a wonderful person. And, I don't want, Patrick, we've had people say that to us at the store, that sometimes they don't come, to meet an author because they don't want their reading, their pleasure in the books to be affected by whether the author turns out to be less wonderful.
Yeah.
Basically.
I so empathize with that. Actors or my wife will say, oh, so-and-so is being interviewed. And I always say, I don't want to see it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll never forget going as the date with Joanne Harris to the premiere of Chocolat. And up until that time, I thought Johnny Depp was a really interesting person. And after I had dinner with him at the plaza afterward, I hated him. I have never liked him since. It was like, that's it. So you do have to be really careful about meeting your heroes. And but I'm happy to say that almost all authors that we interact with have really been wonderful. Generally, they're on their best behavior. There's no point in going on a book tour to sabotage yourself. So, but authors, like other creative people, have very interesting lives. And, not all of them are wonderful, but ideally, when we see them, they are at their best. Just as you always are, Archer. So I've seen you in many forms over the years, and I've always enjoyed our time together. So thank you. And please thank your lovely wife, Margot. And especially, I want to thank you for once again signing our books.
Oh, entirely my pleasure. And the delight was all mine, Barbara and Patrick. Thank you.
Well, I hope to come see you again before we can't do that anymore. So let's work on it. Meanwhile, thank you all for joining us.